Single father adopted two poor little twins. At school, they were called up to solve a math problem as a joke. But their intelligence shocked the entire school. The alarm rang at 5:30 a.m., as always. Grant stretched out his arm in the dark, found the button and silenced the irritating noise that pulled him from a dreamless sleep. His routine awaited him, relentless and predictable. Black coffee, a quick shower, a tailored Italian suit, a silk tie. 42 years old, a civil engineer and owner of Morrison Construction, Grant Morrison lived a life worth millions but felt utterly empty. Monday, meeting with investors. Tuesday, construction site inspections. Wednesday, contract closings. An endless series of days that all felt the same. But that Thursday morning, something was different. A familiar yet sharper ache settled in his chest as he passed through the living room of his penthouse and saw the framed photo on the mahogany shelf. The picture showed him and Norah, his 8-year-old daughter, on one of the rare weekends he'd managed to take off from work. She was smiling, holding up an honor certificate, her arms around his neck. It was 2 years ago, back when they were still a family. Now Norah lived on the other side of the country, in a smaller city on the East Coast, with her mother and her mother's new husband. A man who probably knew what her favorite school subjects were, which cartoons she watched, what her dreams and fears were, things Grant had never taken the time to discover. Grant picked up his phone and, for a moment, considered dialing the number he rarely used, but it was 6:15 a.m. on the West Coast, which meant 9:15 there. Norah would be in school. And his ex-partner, Sarah, had made it clear that unscheduled calls disrupted their daughter's routine. Instead, he opened the messaging app and played the audio he'd kept saved for months. Norah's voice, sweet but growing more distant each time he heard it, echoed in the silent apartment. "Hi, Dad. I hope you're doing well and that business is going fine. I wanted to tell you I won the school science fair. My solar energy project got first place. Mom said you'd be proud, but that you're really busy right now. Maybe you can call me when you have time. I have a lot to tell you." The words, "when you have time," cut like a blade. Grant remembered the last phone conversation they'd had about a month ago, when he'd had to hang up midway because an important client was on the other line. Norah had started to tell him about a school project, and he'd mumbled something about calling her back. He never did. Now, alone in that penthouse overlooking the bay, Grant wondered when he'd become the type of father whose daughter had to schedule a time to speak with him. The private elevator took him straight down to the underground garage, where his black BMW 7 Series was waiting. All the way to the office, he was on the phone with architects, discussing the details of a project worth $80 million. At Morrison Construction, which occupied 3 entire floors of a building in the city's financial district, the hours dragged by in meetings about contracts, residential towers, shopping malls, all very profitable, all very important for maintaining the empire he'd built. In the afternoon, his associate Marcus casually mentioned weekend plans. "We're taking the kids to the zoo. Little Sarah can't wait to see the pandas." "What about you, Grant? Any special plans?" Grant mumbled something about reviewing business proposals. Marcus nodded with the polite expression of someone who already knew the answer. At 7:30 p.m., he finally headed down to the garage. The route home was always the same. Along the main avenue, through the financial district, past the expensive restaurants where he sometimes dined alone, and past the luxury residential buildings where people like him lived, successful, busy, and essentially lonely. But that night, a long red light forced him to stop at an intersection he usually sped through. That was when he saw them. On the other side of the street, near the entrance to a subway station, 2 small girls were sitting on an upside-down cardboard box. In front of them, on an improvised tray, were neatly arranged rows of colorful candies and a few chocolate bars. Grant wasn't the kind of man who noticed children on the street. Having lived alone for 2 years, he'd developed a sort of selective blindness to anything unrelated to business. But there was something about these 2 girls that made him turn right instead of going straight when the light turned green. He parked the BMW a few blocks away and walked back. The girls were identical, dark brown hair, messy and dirty, in clothes that had once been colorful but were now stained and torn, with worn-out shoes barely protecting their small feet. They didn't look older than 6, Yet there was a seriousness and weariness in their eyes that didn't match their age, the look of those who knew the streets, hunger, fear. "How much are the candies?" Grant asked, stopping in front of the tray. The two looked at each other quickly, a silent communication only twins develop. $1 each, said the girl on the left in a clear voice. The chocolate bars are $3. Grant rifled through his wallet. "I'll take 2 chocolate bars." While one of the girls carefully set aside the sweets, the other watched him with a curiosity that reminded him of Norah when she was smaller, the same direct way of observing adults. "Do you work in those big buildings?" she asked, pointing toward the financial district. "I do. I'm an engineer." The girl who'd picked out the chocolate handed him the bag. "Thank you, sir." Grant took the change she offered, but something made him hesitate. "What are your names?" "I'm Willa," the first girl answered. "And this is Junie. We're twin sisters." Grant felt something strange in his chest. 2 girls, almost the same age as Norah. For a moment, he imagined his own daughter out there, alone, helpless. The pain was almost physical. "And are you out here by yourselves?" They exchanged looks again. Willa answered carefully. "We take care of ourselves. We're responsible." There was a defensiveness in the reply that made Grant regret the question. He nodded and walked away, but couldn't resist looking back. They were already reorganizing their tray with care. In his car, Grant ate one of the chocolate bars. He couldn't get the meeting with the girls out of his head. The way they looked out for each other, how Willa automatically spoke for both. It reminded him of how Norah used to hide behind him when she was shy. Back in the penthouse, he tried to focus on financial reports, but his thoughts kept returning to those 2 girls. Where did they sleep? Who took care of them? The image of those 2 children merged with memories of Norah, of when she was little and would wait for him at the door when he got home from work. The next morning, Grant left the office early. He told his secretary he had an external meeting, but in truth he drove to the spot where he'd found the girls. They were there in the same position, but this time the tray had small handmade paper flowers. "Did you make these flowers?" he asked, approaching them. "Junie made them," Willa replied proudly. "She's really good with her hands." Junie smiled shyly, a smile that lit up her small, dirty face. It was the same kind of timid grin Norah had when Grant praised her drawings. "How much do they cost?" $5 each. Grant bought 3 flowers and gave them a generous tip. "They're very pretty." "Do you have any kids?" Willa asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. "I have a daughter, but she lives very far away." "Do you miss her?" Junie asked in a childlike frankness. Grant felt a tightness in his chest. A lot. Every day. He looked at the 2 girls and, for a moment, saw Norah in them. "What about you? Do you miss anyone?" "We miss someone too," Willa said quietly. "Who?" "Our mom." The silence that followed was heavy. Where is she now?" Junie was the one who replied. "She died. She got really sick and couldn't get better." There was something in the way Junie said it, so simple, so devastatingly honest, that reminded him of how Norah had spoken when she was younger. "Who's taking care of you now?" "We take care of ourselves," Willa answered with determination. But Grant noticed the dirt under her tiny fingernails. "We sleep wherever we can find a safe spot." "Where do you sleep?" Junie pointed vaguely to a nearby alley. "Sometimes under the bridge, sometimes in the park. Depends on where the police won't bother us." Grant felt something cold settle in his stomach. 2 6-year-olds sleeping on the streets. "And when it rains?" "We hide wherever we can," Junie answered simply. "Have you eaten today?" "We did," Willa replied, but Grant noticed how she swallowed hard. "How about we go to that diner over there?" They hesitated. Willa looked at the candy tray, worried about leaving their work. "You can bring the tray, we'll keep it in my car." At the diner, Grant watched how the girls behaved and felt his heart tighten. Willa cut half of her sandwich and offered it to Junie, an act that reminded him of how Norah used to share her ice cream with him when she was little. "You two take really good care of each other," Grant commented. "We only have each other," Willa replied with a seriousness that no 6-year-old should possess. "And is there anyone who helps you sometimes?" Mrs. Martinez runs a place where kids can stay sometimes, Junie said. But we can't always go there. Grant felt his heart shatter. And you don't have anyone else? Any relatives? No, Willa said softly. It was just Mom and us, and now it's just us. When they returned to their selling spot, Grant bought more flowers and candy. He said goodbye, but he couldn't concentrate on his afternoon meetings. That night, alone in his 5-bedroom penthouse, Grant once again played Norah's voicemail. For the first time, he could imagine other children's voices filling that deadly silence, voices of 2 girls who needed someone just as much as he needed to feel needed again. He looked around his massive apartment, enough space for an entire family, wasted on the solitude of a man who had forgotten how to be a father. And now there were 2 children sleeping on the street, while he had empty rooms and a growing need to fill the void Norah had left behind. On Monday, he returned to the same spot. The girls were there, but something was worse. Junie had a scratch on her arm, and both looked dirtier and more exhausted. Willa was trembling slightly. It had been a cold night. Where did you sleep last night? Under the bridge, Willa replied. But there were some drunk men there, so we had to leave in the middle of the night. And then? We stayed awake in the park until sunrise, said Junie, rubbing her tired eyes. Grant stayed with them for an hour, talking about small dreams. For the first time in months, he felt useful, necessary. The girls listened to everything he said with an attention Norah no longer gave him. They depended on him, looked forward to his arrival, seemed happy when he showed up. He learned that Willa wanted to be a doctor, to help sick people like Mom, and that Junie dreamed of having a house with a yard to plant real flowers. Simple dreams that echoed the dreams Norah had once shared with him. When he got up to go back to the office, he carried something completely new in his chest. He saw in them reflections of his own daughter, the connection he had neglected. But more than that, he saw an opportunity to be for them the father he hadn't managed to be for Norah, a chance to start over, to fill both their emptiness and his own. On Tuesday, he came back, and on Wednesday, and on Thursday. Each day, Grant bought more candies and flowers than he needed, always leaving generous tips. The girls began to smile when they saw him approaching, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the joy of being anticipated, of being important in someone's life. He discovered that Willa was the more practical one, always calculating how much money they needed. Junie was more of a dreamer, always creating new flowers, always imagining what it would be like to have a real family, and Grant started imagining too. He imagined what it would be like to teach Willa how to ride a bike, how Junie would react to having a bedroom all her own, what it would be like to have 2 little girls running through the corridors of his penthouse, filling that empty space with life and laughter. On Friday of the 2nd week, as he said goodbye to them, Junie timidly asked, "Are you coming back on Monday?" "I am," he answered, feeling his heart tighten at the hope in her eyes. "That's good," Willa whispered, and the small smile she gave him filled a little piece of the emptiness he'd carried since Norah moved away. Grant drove home that night knowing something fundamental had changed. These 2 girls were filling a space in his heart he'd thought was dead. They made him feel needed, important, loved in a simple, genuine way he'd forgotten was possible. 2 twin girls needed more than his casual generosity. They needed a home, security, someone to love them unconditionally. And he needed them as much as they needed him. He needed to fill the void Norah had left behind, to feel like a father again, to have a reason to come home besides silence. And for the first time in a long time, Grant wondered if he could be exactly what they needed, and if they could be exactly what his empty life was desperately craving. Grant never imagined 3 weeks could feel like an eternity. After deciding to seek custody of the girls, each day had been a race against time and bureaucracy, interviews with social workers, home inspections of the penthouse, background checks, medical exams, mandatory childcare courses. Grant tackled every step with the same determination he applied to his most complex projects, but this time, the results mattered far more than any contract. The last visit from the social worker, Mrs. Chen, had been the previous afternoon. She walked through every room of the penthouse with a critical eye, checking if it was suitable for 2 children. Grant watched anxiously as she took notes on her clipboard. examining the safety locks on the windows he'd installed, the cleaning supplies locked away in cabinets, the fully stocked first aid kit in the kitchen. "Mr. Morrison," she finally said, "considering your stable financial situation, the suitability of your residence, and the clear bond you've developed with Willa and Junie, I'm recommending approval of temporary custody. You'll receive the official documentation tomorrow." Grant had to sit down. After so many weeks of uncertainty, of sleepless nights imagining the girls exposed to the cold and danger, he could finally take them off the streets. Now, on Friday morning, he was standing at the entrance to the subway station, where he met them every day, holding the official papers in a leather folder. Willa and Junie were in their usual spot, the tray of candies neatly arranged in front of them, but something in their faces seemed different, more tense, as if they sensed something was about to change. "Good morning, girls," Grant said, approaching cautiously. "Good morning," they replied in unison, but Junie shrank slightly behind her sister. Grant took a deep breath. Over the past few weeks, he'd rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but now that the moment was here, words felt inadequate. I have something important to talk to you about," he began, sitting in the plastic chair that had become his usual spot. "You know I care a lot about you, right?" They both nodded but stayed quiet. "And you know I don't like the idea of you sleeping on the streets, especially when it's cold or when there are dangerous people around." "We take pretty good care of ourselves," Willa said automatically, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "I know you do. You're both very brave and responsible, but—" Grant paused, searching for the right words. "What if I told you that you don't have to take care of yourselves anymore?" Junie tilted her head, curious, but Willa frowned. "What do you mean?" Grant opened the folder and showed them the documents. "I got permission to take care of you. Officially. It means you can come live with me, have your own rooms, go to school, and not have to sell candy on the street to eat." The silence that followed was deafening. The two girls exchanged that silent twin communication, but this time Grant could read their expressions clearly. Longing, fear, distrust, hope, all mixed into one emotional tangle that broke his heart. "For how long?" Willa finally asked, always the practical one. "Forever, if you want, but for now it's temporary, to see if we get along living together." "And if we don't get along?" Junie's voice was almost a whisper. Grant felt a lump in his throat. "Then we'll find a better solution, but I don't think it'll go wrong. I really want to take care of you." They exchanged another look. Grant could see the internal battle, the struggle between wanting security and being afraid to trust another adult after so many months on their own. "Can we bring our stuff?" Junie asked, pointing to the worn backpack they always carried. "Of course, and we'll buy new things too. Clothes, toys, books, whatever you want." "Toys?" Willa repeated the word like it was a strange concept. "Your children," Grant said gently. "Children deserve toys." After a few more minutes of hesitation and practical questions, where they would sleep, what kind of food they'd have if they could go out whenever they wanted, the girls agreed to go with him. Grant put their candy tray in the BMW's trunk, helped them settle into the back seat. They refused to be separated, insisting on sitting together, and drove toward the penthouse. During the ride, he watched in the rearview mirror as they looked out the window with a mix of fascination and apprehension. When they pulled into the building's parking area, Junie murmured something about the building being very tall, and Willa asked if normal people were allowed to live in places like that. In the elevator, Grant noticed how the girls clung to each other, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden shift in their lives. When the doors opened directly into the penthouse, they stood still for a long moment, just looking. "This is our home now," Grant said, trying to sound natural despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He guided them through the living room, pointing out each area, but noticed how they stayed close to one another, touching as little as possible. It was as if they feared touching something might break the spell and send them back to the streets. "Do you want to see the bedrooms?" Grant asked. Over the last 2 weeks, he had transformed 2 of the vacant rooms. In the first, he'd placed a pale pink canopy bed, a white desk, shelves filled with children's books, and a dresser with new clothes. The second room was similar but in lavender tones, with art supplies spread out on the table, and colorful origami hanging from the ceiling. "This one's for you, Junie," Grant said, opening the door to the lavender room. "I thought you might like the art supplies." Junie's eyes went wide, but she didn't go in. She just stood in the doorway as though the room might vanish if she moved too quickly. "And this one's for you, Willa." Grant opened the door to the second bedroom. Willa also stayed at the threshold, but Grant noticed how her gaze lingered on the books on the shelves. "You can change anything you don't like," he quickly added, worried about their silence. "They're your rooms now." Can we sleep in the same room?" Junie asked in a small voice. "Of course. We can push the beds together, or you can choose one room to share." "Junie has nightmares sometimes," Willa explained. "I take care of her." "And I take care of Willa when she worries," Junie added. Grant felt his heart clench. "Then we'll figure out a way for you both to stay together and feel safe." They decided to push the two beds together in Junie's room, which was larger. Grant helped move the furniture, and for the first time since they arrived, the girls smiled. Small, tentative smiles, but genuine. The rest of the day passed in a mix of caution and discovery. Grant showed them how everything worked in the kitchen, made it clear they could eat anything they wanted, anytime. When Willa timidly asked if she could take a bath, Grant realized it had probably been months since they'd had access to hot water. Of course, there are clean towels in the cabinet, and new shampoo and soap in the bathroom. They took turns showering, leaving the door ajar so they could communicate. Grant stayed in the living room, listening to the sound of running water and the occasional low laughter, the first truly childlike sounds he'd heard from them. When they came out of the bath, in clean clothes with shiny hair and pink cheeks, Grant almost didn't recognize them. They really were just two little children, despite the forced maturity that life on the street had placed upon them. At dinner, Grant prepared spaghetti with tomato sauce, something simple he hoped they'd like. They ate slowly, still automatically splitting everything, but he noticed Junie's little gasp of delight when she tasted the homemade sauce. "Is it good?" he asked. "Really good," Junie replied, and for the first time, she looked him in the eye while speaking. After dinner, they insisted on helping with the dishes. Grant watched them work in perfect sync, Willa washing, Junie drying, talking softly to each other. The sound of their voices echoing in the kitchen created an atmosphere the penthouse had never known, one of home, of family. Later, as he tucked them into bed, they'd chosen matching pajamas from the drawer full of new clothes, Junie asked, "Grant." "Yes?" "You're not going to change your mind tomorrow, right?" Grant sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the two girls snuggled together. "No, Junie, I'm not going to change my mind. You're safe here." "What if we break something?" Willa asked. "Things can be replaced or fixed. You two are far more important than any object." He stayed with them until they fell asleep, watching how their faces relaxed for perhaps the first time in months. When he finally left the room, leaving the door ajar as they'd asked, Grant went to the living room. The penthouse felt different. It wasn't just the scattered toys or the small clothes drying in the bathroom. There was something deeper, a new energy, a life that had never existed there before. For the first time in years, his home truly felt like a home. Grant sat on the couch and looked around the living room. Small signs of the girls' presence were everywhere. Their worn backpack carefully placed in a corner, a drawing Junie had done in the afternoon, stuck to the fridge, the faint scent of child's shampoo still lingering in the air. He thought about calling someone to share this monumental change, but realized he had no one. Marcus would probably think he'd lost his mind. Sarah? Well, Sarah would be surprised, but also concerned about his motivations. And Norah was far away, living her own life with people who truly mattered to her on a daily basis. No, this moment was just for him and the girls. It was about building something new without needing external validation. Grant got up and quietly walked to the door of the girls' room. They were sleeping soundly, Willa's arm protectively draped over Junie, both with more peaceful expressions than he'd ever seen. For the first time in months, they didn't need to sleep with one eye open, fearful of danger. He stood there for a few minutes, watching their gentle breathing, listening to the occasional little sighs. It was a sound his home had never known, the sound of children sleeping safely. Grant closed the door gently and went back to the living room, where he sat on the couch once more. The silence was unlike any he'd experienced before. It wasn't empty or oppressive. It was filled with possibilities, with hope, with a responsibility that both scared him and completed him. For the first time in a long while, the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with possibilities, second chances, the beginning of a family forming. Grant smiled into the darkness and headed to his own bedroom, knowing that tomorrow would be the first day of a completely new life for all of them. Grant had carefully researched before choosing Westbrook Academy. The private school had a stellar reputation, modern facilities, and a rigorous academic curriculum he believed would be perfect for two smart girls like Willa and Junie. What he hadn't considered was how the children from established families would receive two girls whose background was so different from theirs. On Monday morning, 3 weeks after the girls moved into the penthouse, Grant accompanied them to school. They wore new uniforms, navy blue blazers, pleated skirts, and shiny black shoes. But there was still a visible tension in their shoulders, a caution he'd hoped would disappear with time. "You'll be fine," he said, kneeling to their eye level in front of the school gate. "If you need anything at all, just ask someone to call me, okay?" Willa nodded, always the calmer of the two, but Grant noticed how she gripped Junie's hand a bit tighter. "What if nobody wants to play with us?" Junie asked, her voice carrying a worry that broke Grant's heart. "Then you play together like you always have," he answered gently. "But I'm sure you'll make friends. You're both special girls." He watched them walk toward the main building, their new backpacks swaying on their small shoulders. Feeling a pang of concern he tried to ignore. They talked about school, about how it would be different than living on the streets, but maybe he hadn't prepared them or himself enough for all the challenges to come. The first week passed without major incidents. The girls came home quietly, and when Grant asked about their day, they gave general responses. It was good. The teachers are nice. The cafeteria food is good. He attributed their reserve to a natural adjustment period. It was in the second week that things began to change. Grant first noticed in the small details. Junie, who had started to speak more openly at home, went back to being quiet during dinner. Willa, always organized, began taking longer to pack her backpack in the morning, as though she dreaded going to school. On Wednesday, he found Junie quietly crying in the bathroom before bed. "What happened, honey?" Grant asked, sitting on the bathroom floor next to her. "Nothing," she mumbled, but her tears told a different story. "Junie, you can tell me anything. I promise I'll try to help." She looked at him with those big, sad eyes. "It's just, some girls at school said things." "What kind of things?" "They said Willa and I are street girls and that we shouldn't be there. They said you're only taking care of us because you feel sorry for us." Grant felt a cold anger surge in his chest. "Junie, look at me. I'm not taking care of you out of pity. I'm taking care of you because I love you. And those girls are wrong. You have every right to be at that school just like any other child." But even as he said the right words, Grant knew children could be cruel in ways adults rarely imagined. On Friday, the situation escalated. Grant was in the office when he got a call from the school. It was Mrs. Patterson, the assistant principal. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to pick Junie up early today. There was an incident during recess." When Grant arrived at the school, he found Junie sitting in the infirmary, tear-stained and with mud on her clothes. Willa was beside her, holding her hand and glaring furiously at anyone who came near. "What happened?" Grant asked, kneeling in front of Junie. "A few fifth-grade girls pushed her into the mud," Willa explained, her voice trembling with anger. "They said she doesn't bathe anyway, so what difference did it make?" Mrs. Patterson, who had walked Grant to the infirmary, cleared her throat uncomfortably. "We've already spoken with the other students involved. They've been warned about bullying." "Warned?" Grant turned to her, trying to control his rage. "My daughter was humiliated and assaulted, and they just got a warning. Mr. Morrison, I understand your concern, but we have to follow our disciplinary protocols. The girls involved come from important families in the school community, and mine don't," Grant interrupted. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, and in that hesitation, Grant saw the truth. To her, to the school, to that community, Willa and Junie would always be those street girls he had rescued. They would never truly be accepted. Grant took the girls home early that day. During the ride, They remained silent in the back seat, and he could feel their disappointment and pain. At home, he made hot chocolate and sat with them at the kitchen table. "I want you to tell me everything," he said gently. "From the very first day, don't leave anything out." What followed was a cascade of small cruelties that had accumulated over the weeks. Children moving away when they approached. Whispers about how they smelled different or looked dirty, even after a bath. Comments about how Grant must be getting paid by the government to take care of them. Systematic exclusion from playgroups. Jokes about how they probably knew how to steal, since they lived on the streets. Each story was like a punch to Grant's gut. He'd thought giving the girls access to the best education would be a gift, but it was turning into a daily torture. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked when they finished. "We didn't want you to be mad," Willa said softly, "and we thought maybe if we held on, they'd stop." "But they haven't stopped," Junie added. "It just keeps getting worse." Grant felt his heart break. He'd tried to give the girls everything they hadn't had: safety, comfort, opportunities. But he'd inadvertently placed them in an environment where they were constantly reminded they didn't belong. "I'm going to talk to the principal," he said. "I'll make sure this stops." "It won't work," Willa said with a sad wisdom. "They'll just be more careful so the adults don't see." Grant knew she was right. Prejudice was rarely defeated by administrative meetings. That night, after the girls went to bed, he stayed in the living room, sipping whiskey and feeling utterly lost. He had faced complex negotiations and built a business empire from scratch, overcoming challenges that seemed impossible. But he didn't know how to protect two little girls from the casual cruelty of other children. He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, other families were dealing with their own problems, other kids facing their own battles, but that didn't make Willa and Junie's situation any less painful. Grant considered pulling them out of that school and finding another, but he knew the problem wasn't unique to Westbrook Academy. It ran deeper: how society viewed kids like them, prejudice that existed long before they were born. He returned to the kitchen table, where 3 cups of hot chocolate had grown cold. The kitchen, which had become the heart of his new home, suddenly felt smaller, weighed down by the tears shed earlier. Grant washed the cups slowly, the sound of running water the only noise in the silent house. When he finished, he dried his hands and looked around the kitchen, which had become a symbol of his new family life. 3 weeks ago, he'd thought giving the girls a home would be the biggest challenge. Now he realized it was only the beginning. Protecting them, not just physically, but emotionally, would be a battle that could last for years. He went up the stairs quietly and stopped at the door of the girls' room. They slept huddled together, as they did whenever they felt anxious or afraid. Even in sleep, they seemed to be shielding each other from a world that insisted on reminding them they were different. Grant stood there for a long time, watching their soft breathing, silently promising to find a way to make their lives better. He had taken them off the streets but still needed to find something even more precious, a place they could truly belong. Frustration followed him to his own bedroom, where he lay awake until dawn, planning ways to protect 2 little girls from a world seemingly bent on hurting them simply because they'd started life under different circumstances. As hard as he tried, Grant couldn't escape the thought that maybe love alone wasn't enough to protect them from everything, and that realization haunted him more than any nightmare ever could. The Westbrook Academy 3rd grade classroom was immersed in the typical lull of a Tuesday afternoon. Ms. Carver, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pinned loosely and glasses always hanging from a chain, observed her students with the patience of someone who had dedicated 25 years to teaching. Willa and Junie sat at their usual desks, 2 rows back by the window, always together if possible. In the weeks following the recess incident, they had become even more invisible, only speaking when called upon, avoiding any situation that might draw unwanted attention. "All right, children," Mrs. Carver said, lightly tapping the whiteboard marker on the desk. "Today we're going to do something different in our math class." She turned to the whiteboard and began writing a sequence of numbers and operations. The class watched with mild interest. Math was usually predictable, with simple addition and subtraction problems suited for 8-year-olds. But what Mrs. Carver wrote made several children frown in confusion. 8412 is x 15, 8412, x 15 plus 144, 32, 144, 32. Fact. This is a problem normally shown to older students, the teacher explained, turning to face the class. But I believe you're all more capable than you think. Who would like to try solving it? The room stayed silent. Some children exchanged confused looks. Tommy Peterson, usually the first to volunteer, was clearly lost. Madison Wright, the daughter of one of the city's prominent bankers, stared at the board as if the numbers were Egyptian hieroglyphs. "No one wants to try?" Miss Carver asked kindly. "Remember, there's no problem with making mistakes. It's important to attempt." Then a small hand hesitantly rose at the back of the classroom. Willa had raised her hand, but when everyone's eyes turned to her, Grant could see her determination falter. Junie whispered something encouraging and raised her own hand as well. "Willa and Junie," Mrs. Carver said, genuinely surprised. "You'd like to try?" Some kids immediately began whispering among themselves. Grant, who had been asked to the school for a meeting about the girls' adjustment progress, was sitting discreetly at the back of the room when it all happened. "They don't even know how to do simple subtraction," Madison said loudly to her friend Sarah. "How will they solve that?" "Want to bet they'll just copy each other?" Tommy added, eliciting muffled giggles from a few others. "Ms. Carver clapped her hands once, silencing the class. "Quiet, please. Willa and Junie, come up to the board." The two girls stood slowly. Grant could see the tension in their small shoulders, how they supported each other simply by being side by side. When they reached the board, Miss Carver handed each a marker. "You can work together or separately, whichever you prefer," said the teacher. Willa took the marker and looked at the problem. For a moment that seemed to last forever. She just stood there, and Grant feared she might give up under the weight of the class's mocking stares. Then something shifted. Willa straightened, as if a switch had been flipped in her mind, and started writing. First, she put each part of the equation in parentheses, breaking it into smaller chunks. 8412 was 7. The class was silent now, watching with growing curiosity. 7 x 15, 105. While Willa worked on the first part, Junie began the second part of the equation. 144, 112, 32, 9, 12, 9, 3. They worked in perfect sync, as if they could read each other's thoughts. Willa wrote the result of the first part. Junie wrote the second, and then together they completed 105 plus 3 or 108. When they finished, they turned to face the class. The silence was total. Even the usual whisperers had nothing to say. Ms. Carver checked the calculations, her expression changing from surprise to admiration. "Perfect," she said, genuine emotion in her voice. "Absolutely perfect. Not only is the answer correct, but the method you used, breaking the equation into smaller parts, is exactly what I'd expect from much older students." The teacher turned to the rest of the class. "Children, what Willa and Junie just showed us is not only mathematical knowledge, but advanced logical thinking. They understood that a complex problem can be solved by dividing it into more manageable pieces." Grant felt his throat tighten. He had always suspected the girls were special, but seeing them there, mastering a concept clearly beyond the class level, was a revelation. "Where did you learn to do that?" Mrs. Carver asked kindly. Willa and Junie exchanged glances. Junie answered in a low but clear voice, "Our mum taught us to break big problems into small pieces. She said anything hard gets easier if you know how to divide it right." "Your mother was very wise," Miss Carver said warmly. "And you two are very smart." For the first time since arriving at Westbrook Academy, the expressions on the other kids' faces weren't mocking or dismissive. They were genuinely surprised, and in some cases, reluctantly respectful. When Willa and Junie returned to their desks, the atmosphere in the room had changed slightly. The whispered conversations were no longer about the street girls, but about how they'd just solved a problem no one else could even start. Mrs. Carver continued the lesson, but Grant noticed how she sometimes directed more challenging questions at Willa and Junie, and how they answered with growing confidence each time. When class ended, Grant saw something he hadn't before. Some kids lingered, eyeing Willa and Junie curiously rather than with the usual hostility. It wasn't acceptance yet, but it was the start of something different. Miss Carver approached Grant once the room was empty. "Mr. Morrison, could you spare a few minutes?" "I'd love to talk to you about Willa and Junie." Grant nodded, his heart racing slightly. Discussions with teachers hadn't been positive in recent weeks. "Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Carver began, tidying some papers on her desk, "I must be honest with you. When the girls first arrived, I was concerned. Not because they were different, but because I didn't know how to integrate them properly." Grant felt a familiar tightness in his stomach. "But today," she went on, "they completely astonished me. And it wasn't the first time. I've been observing them for weeks, and something extraordinary is happening." "Extraordinary, Miss?" Carver sat in her chair and gestured for Grant to do the same. "Mr. Morrison, in 25 years of teaching, I've rarely seen children with the intellectual capacity Willa and Junie have displayed. I'm not just talking about math, it's the way they process information, make connections, solve problems." She opened a folder and showed Grant some of the girls' work. "Look at this essay Junie wrote about family. The emotional depth, the structure, the vocabulary. It's years ahead of what I'd expect from a 6-year-old. And this science project Willa presented about how plants grow, she not only grasped the basic concept, but linked it to math, geography, and even economics." Grant examined the papers, feeling a mix of pride and amazement. "Have they always been like this?" "I suspect so, but they probably never had the chance to fully show it before. What impresses me is not just raw intelligence, but the maturity of their thinking. They approach problems like little scientists." Miss Carver leaned forward, her expression serious. "Mr. Morrison, these girls need additional stimulation. The regular curriculum, even at a school like ours, won't challenge them enough. They need advanced materials, complex projects, opportunities to explore their natural curiosity. What do you suggest?" "First, books. Lots of books at various difficulty levels. Not just children's books, but material that challenges them intellectually. Second, consider extracurricular activities that foster critical thinking. Chess, science clubs, maybe even introductory programming." Grant mentally noted all of it. "Most importantly," Ms. Carver added, "keep talking to them about complex ideas. They soak up information like sponges, but more than that, they want to understand how and why things work the way they do. Do you think they might be considered gifted?" Ms. Carver paused for a moment. "Mr. Morrison, I can't make an official diagnosis, but based on what I've observed, I'd say it's very likely. I strongly recommend you seek a proper psychopedagogical evaluation, not to label them, but to better understand how to support their development." Grant felt something stir within him, a mix of pride, responsibility, and something deeper. "Ms. Carver, may I ask, after what happened today, how do you think the other children will react?" The teacher smiled for the first time in their conversation. "Children respect competence. Mr. Morrison, it may take time, but what happened today planted a seed." For the first time, the other kids saw Willa and Junie not as different in a negative way, but as capable of doing something they themselves cannot. "Do you think that'll make a difference?" "I believe so. It won't solve everything overnight, but it's a start. Respect is often the first step toward acceptance." When Grant left the school that afternoon, his mind buzzed with everything Mrs. Carver had told him. He drove on autopilot, processing the implications of what he'd just discovered. The girls he'd taken in out of compassion weren't just vulnerable children who needed care. They were extraordinary minds that needed intellectual nurturing. What had started as an act of charity had become something far more significant. At home, while Willa and Junie did their homework at the kitchen table, Grant watched them with new eyes. They worked with a focus and efficiency he had attributed to the forced maturity of life on the streets, but now he realized it was something else, an indicator of minds that processed information differently, more effectively. That night, after the girls went to sleep, Grant stayed in his office, researching everything about gifted children, advanced educational programs, and ways to nurture exceptional talents. Around midnight, he leaned back in his chair. One realization had crystallized in his mind. What started as an emotional decision to help two homeless kids had become something much larger. He wasn't just raising two little girls, he was shaping two futures that could be extraordinary. It was a responsibility that both terrified and inspired him in equal measure. Grant opened a drawer and pulled out a folder he'd been avoiding for weeks. The papers to begin the process of permanent adoption. He'd hesitated because temporary custody felt less final, less daunting. But now, after what he'd seen and heard, Grant understood this was no longer a temporary experiment. Willa and Junie weren't just two kids he was helping, they were his daughters, in every meaningful sense. He grabbed a pen and began filling out the forms. Each signature, each completed section, was a commitment not only to their present, but to a future he now knew was limitless in potential. Outside, the city slept, but Grant worked until dawn, finalizing on paper what his heart already knew, that these two extraordinary girls were his family, and he would do everything in his power to give them not just love and safety, but all the opportunities their brilliant minds deserved. What began out of compassion had become the most important project of his life. Change didn't happen overnight, but Grant could feel it in the air like the promise of rain on a summer afternoon. First, there were the looks. Where before there'd been disdain or indifference, now there was guarded curiosity. The children at Westbrook Academy watched Willa and Junie with a different kind of attention, as if they were finally seeing them for who they really were, instead of what they imagined. In the second week after the math incident, Grant noticed that the girls came home with slightly less tense expressions. Still cautious, still reserved, but there was something new in their posture, a hint of confidence. "How was school today?" he asked on a Wednesday, as they took off their coats by the door. "It was different," Willa said, choosing her words carefully. "Different how?" "Tommy Peterson asked me if I could help him with his math homework," Junie said, sounding surprised. "He's never talked to me before except to, well, be mean." Grant felt a spark of hope. "Did you help him?" "Yes, and he said thanks." Junie sounded amazed, as if basic politeness from Tommy was unexpected. "That's a start," Grant said, trying not to show how much that small victory meant to him. On Friday, the shift was more obvious. Grant was picking the girls up from school when he saw something that made his heart surge with emotion. Willa was sitting on a bench in the courtyard, patiently explaining a math problem to three classmates gathered around her like she was a miniature teacher. Not far away, Junie was showing Sarah Chen how to fold a complex origami design, her small hands deftly shaping the paper with an artist's precision. Sarah, the same girl who'd whispered cruel remarks weeks before, now watched Junie with genuine fascination. "Mr. Morrison?" Grant turned to see Miss Carver approaching with a smile. "They're integrating well," the teacher noted, following his gaze to where the girls were. "It's impressive how things can change when children realize they have something to learn from each other." "They seem happier," Grant said, watching Junie laugh as Sarah managed a particularly tricky fold. "And more confident." Yesterday, Willa raised her hand to answer a science question that left half the class scratching their heads, and when she explained it, she was so clear that even I learned something new. Grant smiled. "They've always been special. They just needed a chance to show it. Well, now they have that chance. And the other kids are starting to see it too." That afternoon at dinner, the girls were more talkative than Grant had seen them in weeks. "Madison invited me to sit at her table at lunch," Junie said, mixing her mashed potatoes. "She said I make the prettiest origami she's ever seen." "And Marcus Williams asked if I want to join the chess club," Willa added. "He said if I'm good at math, I might be good at chess too." Grant put his fork down. "Do you want to join the chess club?" "I want to try," Willa said, with a timidity Grant rarely saw in her. "Do you think I can?" "Honey, you can do anything you want. If you want to learn chess, we'll get a board so we can practice at home too." Willa's eyes lit up in a way that made Grant's heart race. Really? Really? In the following weeks, invitations multiplied. Invitations to lunch together, to play at recess, to collaborate on group projects. The girls, who for so long had been outcasts in the class, suddenly found themselves at the center of a growing social network. Grant watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and relief. When they came home now, they talked about friends, about plans for the next day, about invitations to birthday parties, Normal conversations from normal kids, and that was all he'd ever wanted for them. But one Tuesday night, 3 weeks after the math incident, something happened that changed everything for Grant. He was in the kitchen making dinner when he heard a minor argument in the living room. It wasn't serious, just the kind of everyday dispute between siblings about which TV show to watch. "Junie, it's my turn to pick." "But you picked yesterday." "No, you picked yesterday." Grant smiled to himself, ready to step in if needed, when he heard Junie say, "Fine, let's ask Dad which one of us picked yesterday." The world stopped. He froze in the kitchen, wooden spoon suspended mid-air, the sauce bubbling in the pan forgotten. They had said, "Dad," not Grant, not Mr. Grant. "Dad, Dad," Willa yelled from the living room. "Do you remember who picked the show last night?" Grant tried to respond but found he couldn't speak. His throat had closed up completely, and his eyes burned with tears he fought to hold back. "Dad?" Junie appeared in the kitchen doorway, frowning with concern. "Are you okay?" Grant cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "I'm great, sweetheart. You can figure it out between yourselves, okay?" But Junie now knew him well enough to notice something was wrong. "You're crying," she said, stepping closer. "I'm not crying," Grant lied, even as a tear slipped down his cheek. Willa appeared in the kitchen too, and the two girls stood on either side of him, looking up with worry. "Did we do something wrong?" Willa asked, her voice small and anxious. Grant knelt down so he was at their eye level, unable to hold back the tears any longer. "No, you didn't do anything wrong. You did something very, very right." "What?" Junie asked, confused. "You called me Dad." The two looked at each other, and Grant saw the exact moment they realized what they'd done. "That's how we think of you," Willa said simply. "You're our dad. You take care of us, protect us, love us," Junie added. "Isn't that what dads do?" Grant pulled them into a hug, not bothering to hide the tears anymore. "That's exactly what dads do," he murmured against their hair. "And you two are my daughters. My special girls." They stayed that way for a long moment, huddled in the kitchen while the forgotten sauce bubbled on the stove. Grant felt as if something fundamental had clicked into place, like a missing piece that had finally been found. When they finally let go, Junie looked at him with that surprising seriousness she sometimes had. "You never had a real family before, did you, Dad?" The question caught him off guard. I had you two, and I have a daughter, Norah, who lives far away." "But you were alone before we arrived," Willa said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Grant admitted. "We were alone too," Junie said. "But now we have you. And you have us. And we have each other," Willa added. Grant smiled through his tears. "We do. We're a family." "A real family," Junie affirmed. That night, after the girls went to bed, Grant stayed in the living room a long time, letting what happened sink in. For the first time in his adult life, he felt part of something greater than himself. He wasn't just a provider or caretaker, he was a dad, in the deepest sense of the word. But there was a shadow over his happiness, a persistent awareness that the family he'd found still wasn't complete. Somewhere across the country, Norah was growing up without him, living her own life with people filling roles he should have filled. Grant looked at the photo on the shelf where Norah smiled at the camera in a picture that felt like it belonged to another century. 3 important people in his life, 2 who called him Dad and slept safely upstairs, and 1 who barely remembered what it was like to have him around. He picked up his phone, looked at it for a long moment, then set it down again. Not tonight. Tonight was for savoring what he'd achieved, for letting himself feel the pure joy of finally having a functioning family. But a part of him knew he'd soon have to make a decision about Norah. Willa and Junie had given him something he'd never had before. A true home, a real family. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way to bring Norah into that family too. For now, though, Grant contented himself with sitting in the quiet living room, listening to the soft sound of 2 little girls sleeping safely upstairs, knowing that for the first time in a long while, he was exactly where he should be. He was a dad. They were his daughters. They were a family. And for now, that was enough. Grant had rehearsed his words 1,000 times. For 3 days straight, ever since Willa and Junie had first called him Dad, he'd stared at his phone, mentally dialing the number he knew by heart, imagining how he would start the conversation. "Sarah, it's me. Sarah, we need to talk. Sarah, I know I have no right." But every opener sounded inadequate, too small for the weight of what he had to say. How do you ask forgiveness for years of neglect? How do you explain that you finally understand what it means to be a father, but only because 2 girls who weren't biologically yours had taught you? It was a Thursday night. Willa and Junie were in their room doing homework, their soft voices drifting down the hallway as they discussed math problems. Grant was in his office, staring at the phone like it was an alien artifact. He had spent the entire day at work unable to focus on anything. Important contracts waited for his signature. Multi-million-dollar projects needed his attention, but all he could think about was Norah, how she'd grown up without him, how his own words, "when I have time," had become an insurmountable barrier between them. His life had changed so drastically that sometimes he stared at his reflection in the mirror, looking for physical signs of the transformation he felt inside. The man who had become Willa and Junie's dad was fundamentally different from the man who lost Norah by always being too busy, but the question that haunted him was, is it too late to apply what he'd learned? Grant picked up the phone, dialed the first few digits, and hung up. He did this 3 times before finally letting the call go through. The phone rang twice before someone answered. "Hello?" Sarah's voice was exactly as he remembered, soft, melodic, but with a cautious edge that hadn't been there when they were married. "Sarah, it's me, Grant." A pause. Grant imagined Sarah glancing at the clock, frowning, wondering if something had happened for him to call outside their arranged monthly phone times, when they happened at all. "Grant, is everything okay? You never call at this time." "Everything's okay. I wanted to talk to you. About Norah. About us. About a lot of things." Another pause. Longer this time. "Grant, if this is about money or changing child support—" "It's not about money," Grant interrupted, maybe with more urgency than intended. "Sarah, I know I have no right to ask for anything. I know I messed it all up, but I miss her. I miss our daughter." The silence on the other end was so long, Grant wondered if the call had dropped. "Grant," Sarah said finally, her voice softer now, "you've always missed her. The problem was never that you didn't miss her. The problem was you never did anything about it." The words stung, but Grant knew they were true. "I know," he said. "I know I made a mess of things. I know I was a terrible father. But—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "Something has changed in my life, Sarah. I've changed." "What changed?" Grant glanced toward the hallway, where he could hear Junie asking Willa about a science project. "I learned what it really means to be a dad." Sarah laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Grant, you've been a father for 8 years. A bit late for that realization, don't you think?" "Yes," he admitted. "It's late, maybe too late. But I had to call you because I finally understand what you were trying to tell me all those years." "And what was I trying to tell you?" "That being present isn't just physically being in the same house. That love isn't what you feel, but what you do. That kids need you not when you have time, but when they need you." Another silence, and Grant continued. "Sarah, I'm not calling to ask for us to get back together. I know that time is gone. I know you've made a new life. And Norah has a family that's probably better than anything I could have offered back then." "Then why are you calling?" Grant took a deep breath. "Because I want to try to be the father she deserves, even if it's late, even if it's hard, even if she doesn't want me." Sarah's voice sounded different now, more thoughtful, less defensive. "Grant, what happened? You sound different." "I adopted 2 girls," he said simply. "Well, I'm in the process of adopting them. They're 6, twins. They were living on the street." "You adopted?" "They taught me things about myself I never knew. They taught me what it means to put someone ahead of work, ahead of business, ahead of myself." Grant could hear Sarah breathing on the other end. And now you want to apply those lessons to Norah. I want to try if she wants, if you'll allow it. Grant. Sarah paused, and he imagined her running a hand through her hair, a habit she had when thinking something through. Norah asks about you sometimes, more than you might think. Grant's heart clenched. She does. She asks if you're okay, if you still work so much, if you still remember her. God, Sarah. Of course I remember her. She's my daughter. I know that, but she doesn't know that. For her, you're the person who was always too busy, who always had some more important meeting. Grant closed his eyes, bearing the full weight of his mistakes. How do I fix that? I don't know if you can, Sarah said honestly. But maybe you can build something new. Would she be willing to see me? Another long pause. Grant, I'll be honest. Robert is a wonderful father to her. He's present, involved. He never misses a recital or a parent-teacher conference. Norah loves him. Grant felt that familiar stab of envy and regret. But, Sarah continued, she also knows she has another father. And I've never spoken badly about you to her, even when I was angry. So yes, I think she'd like to see you. Really? Really? In fact, Sarah hesitated. I'll be there next week for a work conference. I could bring her with me, if you'd like. Hope flooded Grant like a tidal wave. You'd do that. I can go slow, no pressure. Maybe just lunch or an afternoon. She wants to see you, Grant. She always has. Grant had to sit down. His legs suddenly seemed unable to hold him. Sarah, I don't know what to say. Say that you'll really be there this time, not just physically but emotionally, that she'll have your full attention. She will, Grant promised, all of it. And Grant, these girls you adopted, will Norah meet them? Grant hadn't considered that. If she wants to, if you think it's appropriate. I think it would be good for her. She's always wanted siblings. When Grant hung up 20 minutes later, his hands were shaking. He sat in his office a long time, taking in what had just happened. Norah would be there next week. His daughter, whom he hadn't seen in 6 months, would be here in his home, meeting Willa and Junie. The office door opened softly, and Junie stood at the threshold. Dad, are you okay? You look different. Grant looked at her, one of the 2 little girls who'd taught him what it meant to be a father, and smiled. I'm great, sweetheart. Actually, I have some news to share with you and Willa. What kind of news? My daughter, Norah, will be coming to visit us next week. Junie's eyes widened. Your other daughter, the one who lives far away. Yes, you'll get to meet her. Junie ran back to the bedroom, and Grant heard excited chatter between her and Willa. A few minutes later, they both appeared in the office. Is it true Norah's coming? Willa asked. It's true. Will she like us? Junie asked, her voice full of a familiar anxiety. She'll love you, Grant said, conviction in his tone. Just like I do. The following week, Grant was more nervous than he'd ever been in any major deal. He tidied the house 3 times, bought enough groceries for an army, and changed clothes twice before Sarah and Norah arrived. Willa and Junie were almost as nervous as he was. They'd picked out their nicest outfits and were acting unusually formal, as if preparing to meet royalty. When the doorbell rang, Grant took a deep breath before opening it. Sarah stood there, older but still beautiful, smiling nervously, and next to her, Norah had grown so much that Grant barely recognized her. She was taller, her hair longer, and her eyes, those eyes, were more serious than he remembered. She wore a blue dress and held a small backpack against her chest. Hi, Dad, she said, and her voice was more mature, more guarded than he'd expected. Hi, sweetheart, he replied, kneeling down to her level. You've grown so much. You look different, too, she said, studying him curiously. Sarah smiled. I'll pick her up at 5, okay? Have fun. When Sarah left, Grant, Norah, Willa, and Junie were left standing in the living room in a mix of uncomfortable expectation and nerves. So, Grant said finally, these are Willa and Junie. Girls, this is Norah. Hi, Willa and Junie said in unison, clearly rehearsed. "Hi," Norah answered, her eyes shifting between the two girls with curiosity. Lunch was initially tense. Norah answered questions politely, but there was a distance in her responses that broke Grant's heart. She seemed to be observing everything, how he interacted with Willa and Junie, how they behaved with him, how this new family dynamic worked. It was during dessert that something changed. Junie was talking about school, about how she and Willa were starting to make friends. When Norah asked, "Were you sad before coming to live here?" the question caught everyone off guard. Willa and Junie exchanged looks. "Sometimes," Willa admitted, "we felt alone." "I feel alone sometimes," Norah said softly, "even though I have a family." Grant felt his heart splinter. "Why, sweetie?" Norah looked at him with those serious eyes. "Because I always wanted a dad who wanted to be with me, not just see me once in a while." Grant didn't know what to say. How do you tell a child you didn't know how to be a father until you learned from other children? "Norah," he finally said, "I always wanted to be with you. I didn't know how. And now you do." Grant looked at Willa and Junie, who were quietly watching the conversation. "I'm learning," he answered honestly. "Every day." The rest of the afternoon went more smoothly. Norah gradually relaxed, laughing at Junie's jokes, impressed by Willa's intelligence, joining board games with growing enthusiasm. When Sarah returned to pick her up, Norah was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing. "What are you drawing?" Grant asked, sitting beside her. "Our family," she said simply. Grant looked at the picture. It showed 4 stick figures, 1 tall man and 3 girls of slightly different heights, all holding hands, all smiling. "It's beautiful," said Grant, his voice catching. Norah glanced at him, then at Willa and Junie, who were washing the dessert dishes, and back at her drawing. "We're not that yet," she said, pointing at the picture. "But we could be, couldn't we?" Grant felt tears threaten. He took the drawing as if it were the most precious artifact in the world. "Yes, sweetheart. If you want, and we can be." When Sarah and Norah left, Grant stood in the living room holding the drawing. Willa and Junie sat on the couch next to him. "She seems nice," Junie said. "She's really smart," Willa added. "And she draws well." "She likes you," Grant said. "I could tell." "Do you think she'd want to be our sister?" Junie asked hesitantly. Grant looked at the drawing again, 4 stick figures representing a family that didn't yet exist but could. "I think so," he said. "I think we all want the same thing." "What's that?" Willa asked. Grant put his arms around both girls, still holding Norah's drawing. A real family. All together. That night, Grant placed Norah's drawing on the fridge alongside Willa and Junie's schoolwork. A small gesture, but it symbolized something bigger. Space being made. A door left open for a possibility that suddenly felt within reach. He knew it would be hard, that there would be obstacles, difficult conversations, moments of doubt. But for the first time since Norah was born, Grant felt he truly understood what it meant to fight for a family, and he was ready to fight. The penthouse garden had never been used for serious conversations. Grant had hired landscapers to create a green space on the rooftop terrace, but it had always been more about status than function. The plants were well maintained by a service crew. The wrought iron chairs stayed pristine under an elegant pergola, but until a few weeks ago, the area rarely saw human life. Now, with Willa and Junie running between the plants and Norah cautiously exploring every corner of the terrace during her second visit, the rooftop finally had a purpose. The girls were across the way, near a small fountain, talking quietly while Junie taught Norah to fold another origami figure. Sarah was sitting in one of the chairs, watching the girls with a thoughtful expression Grant recognized from their married days. It was the same look she'd have when she was sorting through something important in her mind, organizing her thoughts before speaking. "Grant," she said, not taking her eyes off the girls, "can we talk?" He sat in the chair next to her, feeling a familiar tension settle between them. It wasn't hostility. Those days were gone. But there was a cautious formality that would always be there now. "Sure," he answered. Sarah was silent for a moment, watching Norah laugh when Junie folded a more elaborate paper bird than the others. She's different here, Sarah said at last. More relaxed. More free. Grant looked at Norah, who was trying to replicate Junie's complex fold. Different how? At home, she's more reserved, more careful, like she's always making sure to be the perfect daughter. And here she doesn't have to be perfect. Sarah turned to look directly at him. Here she can just be a kid. Maybe because Willa and Junie let her. Grant nodded, unsure how to respond. He'd noticed the same thing, how Norah seemed lighter when she was playing with the twins, as though an invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Grant, Sarah said, her voice more serious now, I need to tell you a few things. Things I should have said a long time ago. He braced himself for what was coming. Conversations with Sarah always felt like minefields, full of unresolved hurts and accusations he knew he deserved. Our relationship didn't work out, she began, because you were arrogant and lived for your job. The words stung, but Grant didn't protest. He expected them. I was alone, Grant. Completely alone. Married, but alone. Norah was growing up, and I was basically raising her by myself. You were physically there sometimes, but never really there. Grant lowered his head, studying his own hands. Everything Sarah said was true, and he knew it. When you missed her recitals, or forgot about a school meeting, or took business calls during dinner, you always had an excuse. There was always something more important happening. Sarah, let me finish, she said firmly. When I got the chance to start over, I left. I took the transfer to the East Coast, moved with Norah, and yes, raised our daughter the way I felt was best. When I met Robert, I married him because he was everything you weren't. Present, dedicated, interested in being a dad. Grant felt the old pang of jealousy and regret, but stayed quiet. And all these years, I carried anger. Anger that you wasted our family. Anger that Norah grew up wondering why her father didn't want her around. I always wanted her around, Grant said softly. No, Grant. You wanted her around when it fit your schedule. There's a difference. Silence stretched between them. Across the garden, they could hear the girls laughing, an oddly fitting soundtrack for a conversation about a lost and found family. Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. But now, she paused, analyzing his face. But now you're a different man. Grant looked up to see her studying him with an expression he couldn't decipher. I see it in the way you look at Willa and Junie. I see it in the way they look at you. I see it in the way Norah is responding to you now. Sarah, you've changed, Grant. Truly. And I have to admit that part of me is angry about that too. Angry. Angry that you needed other children to learn how to be a father to your own daughter. The raw honesty of Sarah's words hit Grant like a punch to the gut. But, she continued, another part of me is relieved. Because maybe now Norah can have the dad she's always deserved. Grant didn't know what to say. All the excuses and justifications he'd formed over the years seemed hollow before Sarah's brutal honesty. I don't know how to fix what I ruined, he said at last. You can't fix it, Sarah replied. The past is the past. Norah grew up without you in a way that can't be undone. But you can build something new. How? By being there. For real. Not when it's convenient, not when there's nothing more important going on, but when she needs you, even when it's hard, even when it clashes with your plans. Grant looked at Norah, holding a slightly crooked origami but smiling as if it were a masterpiece. Does she want that? He asked. After everything. She's a child, Grant. Children want love from their parents, even when the parents don't deserve it. She's always wanted you. The question is, are you really ready for her? Grant stayed silent for a long moment, letting everything Sarah had said sink in. For the first time, he fully understood what he had lost. Not just a marriage, man, but years of his daughter's life he would never get back. I can't go back, he said. No. And I can't promise to be perfect. No one's asking for perfect. We're asking for present. Grant looked at Sarah, this woman he had loved and lost by his own arrogance and neglect. Why are you giving me this chance? Sarah gave a sad smile. Because I see how Norah looks at Willa and Junie. She wants sisters. She wants to be part of something bigger, and maybe she can have that with you, in a way she never could with us. What do you mean? Robert is a wonderful father, but Norah will always be the daughter he emotionally adopted. With you, she can be part of something being built from scratch, something where she's not just an addition but a fundamental piece. Grant understood. Norah could be part of the family he was building with Willa and Junie, not as a visitor, but as a central member. That means you'd have to be genuinely present. It means real shared custody, not just sporadic visits. It means Norah could spend summers here, holidays, have her own room, be part of Willa and Junie's daily life. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. What if I fail again? Sarah looked him straight in the eye. Then you'd break your daughter's heart in a way that might never be repaired. So you have to be sure, Grant. Absolutely sure you're ready to put her before everything else. Grant looked at the three girls, now all focused on a collaborative origami project, their heads bent close together, whispering and giggling. For the first time, he realized that rebuilding required more than just acknowledging his mistakes. It required the courage to construct something entirely new on the ruins of what he'd destroyed. And it required the humility to accept he'd need to prove every day that he was worthy of the second chance he was being offered. "I'm ready," he said, and for the first time, he truly believed it. Weekends had taken on a new routine at the penthouse. Every Friday afternoon, Grant drove to the airport to pick up Norah, who arrived on the 4:30 p.m. EOS flight from the East Coast. Willa and Junie always insisted on going with him, standing on tiptoes at the arrivals gate, searching for the familiar figure of their new sister. It was the fourth consecutive weekend Norah was visiting, and Grant could see how each visit made her feel more comfortable. The first time, she was polite but distant. The second, she began to relax. The third, she openly laughed at Junie's jokes and asked genuine questions about Willa's school. Now, watching the three girls at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon, Grant felt something special was happening. Norah was leaning over a fourth-grade math book, frowning with concentration. She'd advanced academically at her East Coast school, but some concepts still challenged her. Willa and Junie were on the other side of the table, seemingly doing their own homework. But Grant noticed they kept glancing at Norah with curiosity. "Ugh," Norah sighed, tossing her pencil down. "I can't figure out this long division. It's so confusing." Willa looked up from her science book. "Which part is hard?" "All of it," Norah admitted, frustrated. "At my school, they explain it in a way that doesn't make sense." Junie got up and walked over to Norah, peering over her shoulder at the problem. "Can I see?" Norah hesitated a moment. She was used to being the daughter who had to handle problems alone, but something about Junie's gentle tone made her nod. "Sure." Willa joined them, and Grant watched their three heads bend over the book. "See," Junie said softly, "long division is just breaking the problem into smaller parts, like breaking a big cookie into little pieces." "It's like the time we solved that hard problem on the board at school," Willa added. "Remember how we separated the equation into easy bits?" Norah nodded, her full attention on her sisters. "So look," Willa continued, picking up a pencil. "You have 144 divided by 12. Instead of doing it all at once, you ask, how many times does 12 go into 14? "One time," Norah ventured. "That's right," Junie smiled. "And what's left over?" 2. "Perfect. Now you bring down the next digit," Grant observed, fascinated, as Willa and Junie teamed up to teach Norah. There was no condescension in their voices, just genuine patience. They explained each step multiple ways, used different analogies when one didn't work, and celebrated every small breakthrough Norah made. "You two are geniuses," Norah declared when she finally solved the problem on her own, her face bright with a genuine smile. "Seriously, you explain better than my teacher." Willa blushed slightly. We like math." "And we like helping," Junie added. They went back to their seats, but Grant noticed how the atmosphere had shifted. There was a new camaraderie among the three, a bond that hadn't been there before. An hour later, the girls were on the living room floor, each working on different projects. Norah was coloring a geography map, Willa reading an astronomy book, and Junie creating a series of elaborate origami pieces arranged in colorful rows. Junie, Norah said without looking up from her map. Do you have a green pencil? Mine broke. I do. Sis, can you grab the green pencil from my backpack? The words came out naturally, without conscious thought. Junie was asking Willa to hand over the pencil, but she'd called Norah sis, the word she and Willa had always used for each other. Everyone froze. Grant Marcy, who was pretending to read the newspaper on the sofa, felt his heart pound. Willa looked up from her book, surprised. Junie went still, suddenly aware of what she'd said. And Norah. Norah simply stood, went to Junie's backpack, took the green pencil and handed it to her younger sister. Here you go, she said, smiling. No drama. No big emotional declaration or formal acknowledgement of what had just happened. Norah simply passed the pencil and returned to her spot on the floor as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But Grant saw the small smile on her lips. He saw how Willa relaxed, a visible relief passing across her face. He saw how Junie continued folding her paper, but with a lighter, happier expression. It wasn't just affection, it went deeper than that. It was a bond. It was sisterhood forming. Grant folded the newspaper and watched the three girls working in comfortable silence, each absorbed in her own task, but all connected by something invisible yet tangible. For the first time since Norah started visiting, Grant allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they really could become the family Norah had drawn weeks before. Three girls and a dad, all smiling, all connected. They weren't there yet, but they were on their way, and that, for now, was enough. Chapter 12. A proposal that changes everything. Grant was reviewing contracts when his secretary announced that Ms. Carver was on the line. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 4 months after Norah had started her regular visits, and he immediately felt concern. Calls from the school during business hours rarely brought good news. Miss Carver? Is everything okay with the girls? Everything's great, Mr. Morrison. The teacher's excited voice came through. In fact, I have some extraordinary news. Could you come to the school today? It's about Willa and Junie. An hour later, Grant was in Mrs. Carver's familiar office, watching her organize papers with barely contained enthusiasm. Mr. Morrison, she began, remember when we talked about Willa and Junie's exceptional potential? Of course. Well, I entered them in the state math competition. It's something I occasionally do with special students. Grant felt both pride and anxiety. And, Mrs. Carver grinned broadly, they didn't just win the state competition, Mr. Morrison, they obliterated it. Their scores were so high the organizers checked them 3 times. Seriously. And now they've been recommended for the national math competition. In 25 years of teaching, I've never had students come close to this level. They have enormous potential. Grant drove home in a fog of excitement. When he arrived, he found the 3 girls at the kitchen table, Willa and Junie doing homework, Norah, on a long weekend break, working on an art project. Girls, he said, trying to contain his excitement. I need to tell you something. They all looked up, curious. Willa, Junie, do you remember that math competition you took part in? Sure, Willa said. It was fun. Well, Ms. Carver called me today. You didn't just win the state competition. You've been invited to the national math competition in Washington, D.C. Silence lasted 3 seconds before the girls exploded in celebration. Willa jumped out of her chair, Junie squealed with delight, and Norah put down her pencils to applaud. The national competition? Willa asked in disbelief. That's amazing, Norah exclaimed. You'll compete with kids from all over the country. Grant shares the news at home. The girls jump for joy. Norah celebrates alongside them. For days, they study, train, dream. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Grant hired a specialized tutor, bought advanced math books, and turned part of the living room into a study center. Willa and Junie threw themselves into it wholeheartedly, studying together for hours, devising systems to memorize complex formulas. Norah became their unofficial cheerleader, making encouragement cards, preparing snacks during study sessions, and sometimes tackling simpler problems herself. I'm not a genius like you two, she said one evening, but I can be the best big sister in the world. On competition day, Grant was more nervous than the girls themselves. They flew to Washington at D.C. It's Willa and Junie's first plane trip, and Grant proudly watched them take it all in with scientific curiosity. "Dad," Willa asked as the plane took off, "do you think our mum would be proud of us?" The question surprised Grant. The girls rarely mentioned their biological mother. "I'm absolutely sure," he replied honestly. The competition was held at an auditorium of a prestigious university. Hundreds of kids from across the country filled the space. Grant sat in the audience with Norah, watching Willa and Junie confidently take their seats, surprisingly calm. "They look so small," Norah whispered. "But they're gigantic," Grant replied. The competition lasted 3 hours. Grant watched them work, occasionally exchanging encouraging looks. They didn't seem stressed, rather, it looked like they were right where they belonged. When the results were announced, Grant had to restrain himself from shouting. First place in the pairs category, Willa and Junie Morrison. The auditorium erupted. Grant felt tears well up as he watched his girls go on stage to receive their trophy. They hugged each other, laughed, and waved at him and Norah. "They won," Norah said in disbelief. "Our sisters won." On the way back to the hotel, Grant made a spontaneous decision. "Who wants pizza?" "All of us," the three exclaimed in unison. They found a family pizzeria. For the next hour, Grant watched his 3 daughters laugh, tell jokes, and relive competition moments. Willa imitated one of the judges, Junie demonstrated how she solved problems using napkins, and Norah took pictures. "For the family album," she explained. When the waiter offered to take a photo of them all, Grant didn't hesitate. They squeezed into a booth, Willa and Junie holding the trophy, Norah hugging her sisters, Grant hugging them all. "Family," Norah shouted when the waiter said, "Cheese," and they all burst out laughing. The victory belonged to Willa and Junie, but what they were celebrating was something bigger, the strength of a family built by love. A few months later, life had settled into a routine Grant never thought possible. Mornings began with the organized chaos of 3 girls getting ready, quiet music over breakfast, laughter in the halls. The penthouse, once a mausoleum of empty success, now pulsed with life. Grant had finalized the legal adoption. He was officially Willa and Junie's father. Norah kept visiting on weekends, each visit feeling more natural than the last. On the living room wall, a new framed photo, the 4 of them at the park, smiling, hugging, as though they'd always belonged together. The photo from the DC Pizzeria captured a moment of pure joy. During a casual Thursday dinner, Willa looked around the table and said, "Dad, this is our crazy family." Grant looked at his 3 girls, 2 who had arrived from the street, 1 returning after years away, and smiled. "Crazy," he agreed, raising his glass of juice. "Imperfect, and mine." "Ours," all 3 corrected at once, laughing. They toasted with orange juice, celebrating something more precious than any champagne could honor. Watching his daughters clear the table, cheerfully humming a made-up tune, Grant knew he had finally found what he'd been searching for without even knowing. It wasn't success, it wasn't money, it wasn't recognition. It was this moment. The feeling of being needed, loved, part of something bigger. A family at last, the kind your heart chooses to love. It was family. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.